I was really taken by your surprise, if you like, of how the exhibition looked. I mean, I suppose, on your train journey to Manchester, you were imagining what it might be like. And you actually mentioned within the film that you had notions of a cabinet of curiosities. And then you articulate it was a very different experience actually walking into the gallery space. And I think you liken it to, a puppet cemetery. So I don't know whether that's an interesting way to begin. To just ask you to comment on that.
My only other encounter with puppets in that context was in the archives of the V&A, where I sometimes work at Blythe House, which is this kind of quite big, kind of Gothic building with cupboards and that are dusty, and it's kind of what you would imagine if you were to think about an archive. And actually the discussions around what's in the archive and what lies dormant and what is awake never come up when you think about those kind of spaces, or at least they didn't come up for me in the same way. So the puppet cemetery, I think, emerged as a hypothetical extension of that kind of space in a very different situation. And I was really struck by the fact that there was something very alive about the kind of atmosphere. There was also something incredibly satisfyingly grotesque about it, and I say that in a very positive way for me anyway. And that actually there was, just like in a cemetery, the idea of these kind of narratives that are sort of half dormant and half awake, which I was really struck by. And also that I didn't really find that there was the same sense of journey that you were, or historical journey that you would normally have in an archive, or that's associated with an archive where the kind of chronology of everything is completely displaced because everything is just old or of the past. And I didn't find that with the exhibition, and I'm curious to hear from you about this relationship between the dead puppet and history and reanimation, because to me that was present in lots of different ways and in very interesting ways.
Well, I suppose, as I say within the body of the creative banter, that it became a really personal journey for me, DEADpuppet, because a lot of the archive was from my personal archive. So there is some kind of weird journey going on. I mean, right back to a piece of work that I reference and pick out, from my student days of 1984. And then all the puppets from the Ducot archive are so loaded with narrative and story. And again, I kind of reference that within the creative banter. I mean, it's interesting how much of that story comes through, because I didn't overlay it with explanation or with video footage of how the puppets used to be used or whatever. I didn't want it to be documentary in that kind of way. I think people found the creative banter really useful because I was able to verbally articulate a lot of that story. So when I wasn't there, I think there was felt to be quite an absence, even though Emma did a terrific job with the invigilation. So I think if I repeated or resurrected the Dead Puppet exhibition, I would really consider my place within it far more, rather than just put the exhibition in and then off I go and leave it.
You use the word resurrect
Mm.
Can you?
Oh, I did that on purpose. I did that on purpose as a kind of, you know, I just love all the kind of uncanny and the kitsch and the grotesque. And so the resurrect is just a very conscious, provocative word.
It made me think that actually there's two situations for me in which exhibitions of performance reside. You've got the kind of historical overview, and then you've got the kind of contemporary recontextualization. And actually, for me, DEADpuppet didn't quite sit in either of those. It carried its own life in a very, very strong way, and I think that's what you maybe mean by your relationship to it, because I think you were very much part of it in that sense. But I also think it carried a lot of different directions with it. And it was artistic, then there was a level of craft, and there was all these kind of art discourses that fitted into the same, that kind of were navigating that space, which I found really exciting in this atmosphere of uncanniness and resurrection and cemetery. So I wondered for you, now looking back, how it travels with you as an exhibition, and whether you feel you've put it to sleep and would have to resurrect it again, or whether it has a different kind of presence, or whether you identify with any of those kind of discourses within it.
Well, I think it was really special that it was in Manchester and that it was at the Zion Centre, because when DEADpuppet was wound up and I was made redundant, which was an incredibly painful and traumatic experience actually, the Zion was like a kind of life raft, because they gave me space to work and also to store a lot of the objects that I saved. And also, as I say within the creative banter, you know, just down the road is Whalley Range, where a lot of the work was initiated and used the life of Whalley Range as part of the story. So I do want to do more DEADpuppets. I think it's a really funky title, and it intrigues people, and it kind of undercuts that stuffiness around the kind of archival puppet and the preciousness. And but I would think of doing it in a different place. I would love to do one in London, because, you know, who bothers to go on a bloody train to Manchester? It needs to be seen in London to attract more attention and air, and, you know, to give it oxygen and to get it be seen. But then it would, you know, be a totally different curated piece, because there wouldn't be that Manchester link. And also, I was hugely privileged because, you know, Liz O'Neill knew my work. In fact, she used to work for Ducot, so she knew the history and respected that I would come up with the goods, because it was very generous. I mean, they gave me the space for 2 weeks getting, and then, you know, just under a month of exhibition. So it will take work to secure that kind of trust from a venue who doesn't know my work so well. So that's why this is so useful, because, you know, it's a way of recording and also showing the work to a wider audience to gain more attention. Do people want to come and gather, and we can maybe start a bit of answering? Well, we're going to sort of move around, Fred, but obviously, firstly, I just want to thank you all for coming along, actually. And the idea of this creative banter, it's all sort of really about my public engagement with my research. And I'm actually really interested in your response to what I've created with the Dead Puppet. This is Deanna Damien, who is a young art critic and academic from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. And that's also where I'm based. I'm a creative research fellow, which is being funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So I've been really interested in reading Deanna's blog and just her take on how she looks at the whole notion of theatre and performance art or live art, and I want to get that woman in here talking about puppets. So when I thought of doing this engagement, I thought Deanna would be a really lovely person to invite, and I hope she's going to be quite provocative and challenging.
No pressure.
Well, particularly me, anyway. The first thing I'll share with you is an absence, actually. And that is, if you see that hook there, my research, I first became a creative research fellow in 2009, and it's part-time, and it's going to end in May next year. But this exhibition has always been part of my research plan. And 3 years ago, I saw this amazing piece of work by Janek Simon, a young Polish sculptor. And basically, it's a ceiling fan, and dangling from it were two trainers, old trainers. The fan was kind of like 1950s. It was an old fan. And as the fan rotated, the trainers kind of moved and they sort of danced, and I just thought it was so beautiful. And I thought, when I'm going to get Dead Puppet together, I want that piece of work, because I wanted to sort of challenge an audience with kind of how we perceive what a puppet is. And so I was going to place it there, and then Justin Farndale, who's done all the lighting, was going to create shadows. So this entire space is going to be given up to Janek's fan, but it never arrived. So even up to 2 weeks before the installation, I was being promised yes, and the money was there to pay for it to come into the country, but it never turned up. And then I kind of contemplated and thought, well, it's still here, because actually, by Janek saying 3 years ago, yes, you can have the fan, it kind of made me perceive of how I would structure the exhibition. So even though it's not physically present, it kind of is, in a way, here. Gosh, my notes, hang on. Well, also, there's... I wanted to have Christopher Leith's puppets for a performance he did of The Overcoat, which was promoted by the Caricature Theatre. And the Caricature Theatre was run by Jane Phillips in Cardiff. And I think it was wound down in about 1960s. And she lost her Arts Council funding. And I never saw a production of Caricature, but as a young, puppeteer, I was always aware of Caricature. So, and particularly Christopher Leith's work. And again, Christopher Leith he was delighted to be asked to be part of the exhibition, but he's so ill, actually, that he couldn't physically go and get the puppets. So, unfortunately, and very sadly, he couldn't loan me the puppets. So there's been a few kind of disappointments and setbacks. But I have a lot up my sleeve, and so therefore there's quite a lot of my own work shown here from my work with DEADpuppet, and that allowed me to be very free with how I've displayed things because there were no restrictions. With these puppets, these that you see here, these are from the Puppet Centre Trust archive. And again, there's been certain restrictions on how I've displayed them, but thanks to Janek's 1950s retro fan, it inspired me to go to IKEA and get their retro cabinets. So it's kind of fed through in that way. But there's Muffin the Mule, and just simply because of insurance, we've had to put it behind lock and key.
Is that the real Muffin?
That is, it's kind of like the real Muffin the Mule. It's the Muffin the Mule that they used to take around to events. So the Muffin the Mule for the television show is actually quite small, and that's within the Hogarth family. Whereas that's part of the Puppet Centre Trust archive, and so I was allowed to exhibit that one. So it's still insured for a phenomenal amount of money. And so it is the original one, yes. So I don't know how we wish to progress. I really do want, I really welcome your interjections and questions. And again, like I say, I hope Deanna's going to be provocative. I must say, my favourite piece in the whole exhibition are the Chinese controls. And I went to the archive of the Puppet Centre, which is in Bridgnorth, and they were just dumped on the floor. And I just thought they were so incredibly beautiful. And it's a delight to have been able to put them into the cabinet. So...
You wouldn't think they were terribly beautiful if you were trying to operate what was on the other end of it. 60 years ago, I used to perform with a group from my school, and we would hang all the puppets on a line, ready to go on and perform, and there would always be somebody who would take one off and bring the whole lot down.
Yes.
And you'd finish up with a bird's nest like that.
Yes.
2 minutes before you're due to go and perform.
Yes, that's...
And at that stage, it does not look beautiful.
Yes, that's one very good reason why I've never really worked with marionettes. Yes. And, the archive donated all the puppets, but the bodies are separate from the controls, so it's now Michael Dixon's job to match the control with the puppet. So that's going to be an enjoyable puzzle. Yes.
Did you think? Oh, no, you go. I'll ask
You turned on puppetry as early as 3 years old?
Yes.
And I'm interested in the progression of your interest, because what strikes me is how grotesque so many figures are in this room. Yes. And I find it a bit frightening, and I wonder, what's your journey been from the age of 3 to where you are now? How did you cope with, violence and maiming, disembowelment?
Yes.
From the age of 3?
Well, it's probably. I was given my first puppet when I was 3 years old. It was a little baby puppet, and it was bought from the Waldo Lanchester shop, which was in Stratford upon Avon. And I just fell in love with puppets, and it's been my passion ever since, really. The grotesqueness may be a reaction, to the puppet theatre that was, when I was growing up. I mean, I lived in Leamington Spa, and it was quite close to Birmingham, and the puppets of John Blundell, actually, at Cannon Hill Puppet Theatre. I'm quite pleased that my parents thought really I should get a proper job, and so they were sort of encouraging of my hobby, but they also encouraged me to go into residential care, actually, and
and art therapy, but that's another story. But that meant that they didn't take me along to John Blundell, because I think if I had become an apprentice of John, I might have ended up coming out as a bit of a kind of model of John's style, which I think is, very interesting and lovely, but it's not quite me. And because I got interested in art therapy, I needed to have a postgraduate in art therapy that they did at St Albans, and I needed a degree. And so that took me on the journey of going to art school and then creative arts, drama and sculpture. And so I started to find my own expression really in the materials, so possibly hence the grotesqueness. And I'm interested in dealing with contemporary issues, and so that's why quite rapidly I moved away from working with a children's audience to working for an adult audience, because I was freer in what I could say, really.
I just wondered, because you studied sculpture, didn't you?
Yes.
For as a degree, or and I wondered, because I think a lot of the really static kind of sculptural objects in the space imply a lot of movement, and I wondered if that was something you were aware of when you were studying, if you were exploring that when you studied sculpture, if you were kind of making puppets on while you were studying sculpture, or.
Well, it was a bit kind of like I kind of studied sculpture because it was an excuse to make puppets, really, and it was an acceptable way of making puppets. It was neat doing sculpture and theatre. I think that was a perfect mix for a puppeteer, actually. I took an intercalated year out, and then I went back because for my final year, because I could specialise in integration of the arts. Which was fusing the two, sculpture and theatre, together. But in terms of movement and sculpture, I mean, I've always loved Calder's work and Tongley, and so and Claus Oldenburg, and I just love Rauschenberg's. I mean, it's just always been there, really. That love of the of that art. Of the American art movement, really. Yeah.
So you mostly built, when you were studying sculpture, you were mostly building things for them that would move, that would potentially
Yes.
move.
Yeah. Or had a narrative. And it was interesting with Deanna earlier, just saying how narrative seems to be important in the work.
Well, leading on from that, I wondered, and I'm talking specifically about that piece over there, behind you, whether you think of the puppets as being out of context in an exhibition?
Well, they're in a totally new context. And we can move over to this figure if you like. I mean, for many, many years, Rachel Field, who was the co-artistic director of Ducot, and at the time my partner, we lived in Whalley Range, which for your Mancunians will know is sort of just down the road. And our first workshop was in quite a dodgy area. It was kind of really, Whalley Range at the time, of the kind of late 80s, early 90s, it was, prostitutes, artists and drug addicts, really. And so a lot of the work was drawn from our lives living in the area. And this show is called Odd If You Dare, and it was like a collage of different stories we had gathered. And actually, quite a big inspiration behind the show was a personal incident that had happened to Rachel and I. I was driving the van and this car tried to cut me up, and I thought, bog off, and kind of. Anyway, I kind of went to park to go to the dry cleaners, and the car drove in front,
and the person got out, this man got out, and was incredibly aggressive to me. He was trying to get me to fight him, and full of abuse, and it was just really bad news. And in the end, he called the police and everything. But his parting shot was, "I'll find out where you live." And then a couple of months later, Rachel was at the window and he walked by and he didn't even look up, he just waved without looking. And it was that notion of having somebody observing your life and having a completely distorted image of how your life, as an out lesbian really was, kind of fueled the idea of this person watching. So within the show was a bigot character who observed this character, and in the end the bigot rapes her and murders her. So this was the beginning image for the show, and it was also the end image. So it was it's quite powerful to actually create life with a puppet and then kill it on stage. Actually, I think people found this a shocking image to witness, and I would contend, more powerful than if you had that with human actors. So then, here we are in the Science Centre in Hume, and, I'm presenting this image, but it's a complete falsity and a lie, actually, because the blood on the puppet wasn't part of the show. That was added a couple of years later when Rachel and I were doing a 24-hour performance, which was actually online. We started at Christmas Eve and worked all the way through until the end of Christmas Day, and we were performing 24 hours. And Rachel, who's this amazing techno wizard, she was kind of in control really of what we were showing, and she kept not wanting me to show the puppets. And I got quite upset about this. I mean, this would be about 4 a.m. when we'd be performing, God knows how many hours. And so I just took every single puppet that I had, and in some way I killed them. So they either had a heart attack, or this one's all blooded and everything. And basically, I just ended up with a pile of bloody puppets, and that was my kind of anger and frustration, to actually destroy the art form that I really love. But of course, again, it's a huge lie, because I can then bring them back to life. So that's the history behind the blood.
So when do you know a puppet is dead?
Well, I don't know, because if we come to this little puppet, here's the toe. And I made this puppet when I was, a student. So this is going back to 1984, I think I graduated. And because it's latex, it's all completely, falling apart. I questioned whether I would show it, and then I thought, oh yeah, I must, because it's actually so beautiful in its deterioration. And is it dead? Is that puppet dead? I've recontextualised it, and I've given it a stage of a shelf and the spotlight and your gaze. So I don't know, do you perceive that as a dead object, or?
Since classes.
Sorry?
Since classes.
Yes.
It's waiting.
In between.
I'm the kiss of love.
I actually think that the more kind of static objects imply more movement. When compared to the marionettes and things, I see them as more dead than some of the others.
Yes, that's
Quite interesting actually, because I've been invigilating the exhibition, and a lot of people that do come to the show, the first thing they want to do with the strings is to move them, and everyone keeps saying to me, oh, I'd love to see it moving, or I'd love to, and I found that quite interesting. and going back to it needs to be sort of theatrical, and that people see puppets and do they want to see them in the context that they are in, or would they rather than be put away and dead? I don't know.
Yeah, because I think it poses an interesting problem to do with the space. Like, are we in a cemetery of puppets? Or are we on a... I know it sounds really morbid, doesn't it? Or are we on a set? Or are we animators walking around? To me, that's kind of an unresolvable question, but it really made me... I thought I would enter a sort of cabinet of curiosities, and I found the space very different from that. And I sort of wondered... I love the idea of a puppet cemetery in a kind of very positive light. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I suppose I'm manipulating you really, because I purposely collaborated with the lighting designer Justin Farndale, because I knew that the lighting would be crucial really, and how the puppets were given that illusion of kind of possible life, and I think the lighting really does enhance the atmosphere a lot. I mean, one visitor said that the exhibition's charged, and I don't know whether people would agree with that. Actually, before I go on that track, I do want to thank you for speaking up, because in terms of the dead puppet, I'm sure there was a tradition in Rajasthan where the puppets of the dead puppeteer were thrown into the river and allowed to drown along with the puppeteer's ashes. I don't know whether you can quantify that or know any history around that, but putting a spotlight on you. But that rather sounded like a sensible idea to me. Actually, to let the puppets die with the puppeteer. I mean, I know within my will I'm going to put, take them to the tip. Take them to the tip.
That is quite interesting.
But you bought some from that man that died a few months later.
Yes.
And you still perform those.
Yeah.
Sorry. And you perform those. So should we die with Joe Beebe?
Yeah.
Or should you be able to take it to a wider audience and carry on his legacy and bring them to life?
Well, I think that's kind of like the dilemma. And I know within the puppet world, some people are very angry that I'm actually using the puppets, because in using them, I'm destroying them. I mean, with the boxing puppets, I do that routine, and I suddenly looked at one of them and thought, bloody hell, where's his ear gone? And I mean, it's got bashed off in the act of using them. But I think if you read Joe's letter to me, I think he very much wanted those puppets to be used.
And going on from that, Nina, do you feel that there is something of yourself in the puppet? Which there must be. I just wondered if you could explore that, which ties in with whether you're going to let the person die and the puppets with them.
Yes.
Do you feel
you mean in the puppets that I've made?
Yes, in the puppets that you've made.
Oh, well, if we go over to this bit, This was a monster made for Frankenstein, the Final Blasphemy. It's actually got a camera for its eye. So when I was animating it, we could project up the monster watching me animate it, if you see what I mean. So it's totally funky. I mean, this is kind of like, I don't know, early 90s. Prior to this, we did a show called Die Young, which was a commission show for the Art Bus in Fife. And it was really basically about sex, drugs and rock and roll. Well, you can't get anything more exciting than that to do a show, and it was for young people. And but working on it, I heard that a young artist who had worked with us 2 years previously had killed herself, and so
I was contemplating the post-mortem that would have been on her body, and it just so happened that a member of our board was married to a pathologist, and so I asked the pathologist to do a post-mortem, a mock post-mortem report of what would have happened to her body, and he said, well, why don't you come and see? So I thought, well, why not? What an invitation. So both Rachel and I went and witnessed some post-mortems, which I think had serious implications and was, quite a distressing thing to see. It's the most beautiful thing I've seen, and also the most stressful. But anyway, so to cut quite a long story short, the stitches on this are actually, I've used the string that they use within post-mortems, and I was given the actual needle as well, which is a bit like an upholstery needle. So for me, I've got all that memory of witnessing the post-mortems, walking along that hospital corridor carrying a ball of string with people going by, and me knowing that people wouldn't have a clue what I had in my hand, and then stitching that in an authentic way. Now you, the audience, you don't know any of that. You don't know, you didn't know any of that now. But I would, and I don't know whether this is me being a romantic, but I would hope that in my connection with the monster within performance, I have all that emotional memory, and I would hope that some of that would come through to you, the audience, so that in a funny kind of way, you would have the information about that string and that story without me actually telling you.
Well, to me, there's an interesting point in there. What's the difference between a puppet and a character? And I impose a character onto him partly because of your narrative, but partly because of what didn't have anyone else knows, this is what you've just said. But I was wondering about the ephemeral work, for example.
Yes.
Which is, you engage with it very differently because it doesn't have eyes and it's not sort of looking down at you, and it's not sort of very in between being dead and alive. And I wondered how you thought of those in the context of the exhibition and those pieces up there, and whether they felt different than some of the other materials that you were working with.
Well, I suppose the obvious answer is in terms of this being a public face of my research and me sharing the whole gamut of that research. And part of it is more wanting to challenge you in terms of how you perceive a puppet. And so my interest in the ephemeral animation is that it's animation without human contact. So it's got no human ego attached. I think to problematize that is that then it removes the binary of the gaze. So it kind of challenges you because you haven't got the funny little eyes to wiggle and waggle at you. So it kind of then possibly goes in a bit deeper in the challenge for you to see that as a life, maybe. But I certainly see all the little films that I've made. I think it's amazing the quality of animation that's there, and it's not tainted by the ego of a puppeteer. And I know that I can't create the beauty that's within those ephemeral moments, really. And that's quite heartening, I think.
Do you think, though, in the ephemeral that the narrative is then lost if it seems puppetry? That you can't put a narrative onto the back, blowing in the wind, or...
I think we continually put a narrative on things. And possibly more narrative on some of those ephemeral things than on, as Sarah was saying, the marionettes. I don't know, I really want to sort of dig into it more.
To me, there's also an interesting problem of the puppeteer in relation to those, whereas in relation to these. Because we've talked about death in relation to these puppets, but when does the ephemeral animation die? And is the gaze what activates it rather than the puppeteer in that instance?
Well, in my heart, it cheers me to think that the whole world is being animated by moments of fragmentary, ephemeral animation that we don't see and we don't witness. And there's a beauty in that. So it's almost more beautiful because we're not seeing it. I don't know if that answers the question, actually.
It's true, I think I would agree with you. It was like yesterday I opened the fridge door and you'd expect the entire fridge to be calm and quiet, but I actually saw a bit of a plastic bag just moving like that. I was really freaked. I found out that the back door wind was coming up and just moving sort of thing like that. I was just watching it. It's quite a strange story.
And then I just wondered, in a way, then do you become the puppeteer of what you've seen? Because you've anthropomorphised that. So I don't know if that's a question.
Yes, well, I mean,
not in terms of things moving into you and it requiring the imagination. I suppose that kind of animation requires a lot more from the imagination of the viewer than what we expect in the kind of conventional puppet theatre.
Well, I suppose as soon as we see something, we're grabbing hold of it and controlling it, and our minds are just. So in that way, I suppose we're the puppeteer. And I mean, what an absolute lie it is to film things. And with my early films, I mean, now I just cringe and think, don't zoom in! I want more.
If you're making things for animation in a film, that removes the element of the person controlling it anyway.
Yes.
I could imagine that if you're standing behind this and operating it, there is more expression from you coming through that than I would get on a film. That you are there with it. And
yes.
It's responding exactly to you doing things. And you just have to be there. Whereas a film distances its audience.
Yes. I mean, it's an interesting area, isn't it? Because it also kind of veers towards animatronics and, people now on film sets animating the puppet from here with a control box or...
takes that human element out.
Yes. I do like the precariousness of having a human with the puppet because, you can't totally control the puppet. It might fall down or something. So there's always that kind of human, that gap for error, which I think is quite important.
I think it's interesting when you put both in a space like this and they become puppets and documents at the same time, and even film becomes, in a way, a similar artifact to a question mark dead puppet. And I wondered what you thought about that in relation when you move everyone to the shadow room.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.